too much. I'm trying to stack all the books that I read, and it's just too many. Spirits up.
Oh my god, babe. That's like
I know. Hi, neighbor. Beep 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 beep. Beep 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 beep. Hello friends, welcome back to another video. Today you are joining me at my desk with a hazardous stack of books. Reason being, I have done a lot of things in the past couple of months, but I did not do an October wrap-up. We are now entering the end of November, and somehow I've accumulated quite the stack of books over the past 2 months. In October, I read a total of 8 books, and in November, there's still 2 days left, so it's possible that this could change, but as of right now, I'm at 14 books. I thought before this gets out of frame, I'll go through it, I'll talk about them all with you. And also really quickly, I don't know if I actually mentioned it in the video, but at the start of the month I did post a video for the Bloom and Readathon, which is hosted by Allison Pages and Kirsty, and here is my bingo card for the end of the month, which I'd say is pretty successful. I didn't really think about that challenge when I was picking the books that I read, but I happened to line up a lot of them with what I said I wanted to read, so I'm pretty satisfied with that. I did not stack these in the order that I read them, so I'm a little bit concerned about how I'm going to pull them all out, but in October, I read a total of 8 books. I started off the month really strong with a 24-hour readathon, and generally I just did a lot of reading vlogs throughout the month because I was really excited to read more spooky books, so I already have videos about a lot of these. First we have Cheese Sweet Home. Cheese Sweet Home is just about this little guy living life, who I actually found out is a lady, which in all of my childhood I just didn't remember that. If you like a book that's no plot, just vibes, these are definitely the ones for you. I also read the second one, which is down here, but it's literally, there is nothing going on. It's just a cat experiencing the joys and the terrors of life. It was really just a nice break from a lot of these heavier books. The only thing I will say is they named her Chi because she kept peeing on stuff, and I read Looking for Alaska, which is something I have on my Kindle. It's the only not physical book, but that is a book that I have loved since, I want to say, elementary school. I've loved it since The Fault in Our Stars came out and John Green was the whole thing, so it's been like, you know, what, close to 10 years? But Looking for Alaska, I think, has always been my favorite of the John Green books. I love the characters, I love the environment. They just seemed like so many fun characters to be around, and obviously they're not the best people, but they're definitely loyal to each other, and I think that was a really fun story to read about. I'm gonna go a little bit out of order here. This is actually the 7th book I read just because it took me so long to get through. It's at the very bottom. Oh. Those are gonna stay on the ground for now. Paper Towns by John Green. I started this the same time that I started Looking for Alaska in this month, but it was one of the last books that I read and that I finished, and that is because it's basically the same plot as Looking for Alaska, but worse. There are definitely some memorable lines in here. There's definitely some fun interactions. I do frequently think about the first night that they have when they're just running around and causing all this trouble. But ultimately, it's about a nerdy guy who falls for a really cool girl who's just like above everybody else. And she's pretty mysterious, and then she just disappears for one reason or another. And in both the books, the main nerdy guy character is trying to figure out where the love of his life went. But also in both situations, they don't know the female character that well. And in both of these books, the characters realize that they don't really know anything about the girls that ran away, but they're still hopelessly in love with them. And I feel like Looking for Alaska just is so much more appealing, which I think is part, in fact, because it feels more mature. This one definitely feels like it's just some high schoolers running around, but I think because Looking for Alaska takes place at like a place where they have dorms, it is still technically like high school age, but because of the setting and because of the circumstances, it definitely feels older in that book, and I feel like that's why I've always preferred it. But these 2 books by John Green have a very special place in my heart. Anyways, after Looking for Alaska, I read The Liminal Zone by Junji Ito, horror manga known for short stories. This was the newest release, and I bought it the second that I found out it was coming out. And the artwork, as always, is something else. These books feel like when you're watching a scary movie and you want to cover your eyes because you don't want to see what's happening next, but it's a book, so you gotta see it to move on. I don't think any of these stories were particularly memorable. There's none that I really think about, but if I do ever look at these stories, they are definitely unsettling. I think my favorite is for sure The Spirit Flow. That one looked and just felt really ominous. I don't think it's my all-time favorite of the stories that he's made, but it definitely you know, it, as always, did what it came to do. Then I read The Spirits Up. I impulse picked this up just because it's got a little ghost guy, it's got some Christmas lights, so you're kind of getting all of the festivities in one. And there was just so much happening with so little payoff. You're following a family where the husband is an inventor, the wife is maybe having an affair, one of the sisters is chronically ill, and the other one is just a bit afraid of the people around her. She just wants to fit in. And also, they all see ghosts. And here is, word for word, what I wrote down in my notes. I said, there's so much happening in such a short time in the intro. It's Halloween, but it's November 30th, and there's 2 perspectives in the first 10 pages, and there's a virus, but there's also a rotten ghost, and also a woman died outside their house. Gotta appreciate the representation. Which, of course, is referencing the one person with this chronic illness, which was very frustrating because you get everybody's perspective except for her, and you just hear everybody talking down on her and saying why she's, like, not useful to them, and why they all feel bad for her, and they don't really want to associate with her. Like, I would love to see what she was feeling, because she seemed like the only decent character in this book, and you don't get to know. And I say this every time, I hate books that are so obviously present day. They're so modern. Because this book came out in the past 2 years, so it talks about Tesla, it talks about wearing masks for a virus, they're talking about Karens, which is the name of the mom. I wrote all of them, especially the wife, are just really annoying, and it feels like one of those horror movies where you're watching a bunch of dumb characters make all the wrong decisions and you just want to yell through the screen and tell them that they're just making bad choices. Except it's a book that's narrated by 3 of these really dumb characters, and it's just kind of unbearable. I feel like that is not the intention of the author. I feel like it's supposed to be a family that's being haunted and they're all dealing with their own stuff, but they are just so unlikable. And then the last thing I wrote was that I don't read a lot of Canada-based books, which I guess this one was. Overall, this was not a memorable book at all. It's not a book that I'm thinking about at all, and it's probably one that I'm gonna get rid of fairly soon. Move you guys down a little as the stack shrinks. I'm gonna go a little bit out of order again and talk about Genderqueer. It's on the ground. Genderqueer is a memoir that I saw on the banned books table. It's written as a graphic novel, ? You're following the author's journey with being non-binary and ace, which I feel like are 2 things that are not very well represented in media, so to get a direct story from somebody who is both, I feel like it's a very important perspective to have because it's one that not many people know about. There are multiple points when I was reading this book where I had to step away, my jaw dropped, like physically opened my mouth because I just couldn't handle it in the best way. And I think choosing to make this book that is so full of pictures is a really good choice because it makes it more easy to consume. Because this is a harder topic for a lot of people to understand, so to put pictures in and to try and make it more accessible, I think it's a really good way to share the story. And also, if I can find it, the artwork is incredible. This is how it feels to listen to David Bowie. And this one I think is my favorite. Look at that. That is so gorgeous. I really love this book. I think it is such good representation and everybody should read it if they can. I don't usually rate memoirs, but this one was just so good. It was at this point that I read Paper Towns, and then I read It by Stephen King. And I have to say, I think this is one of the favorites out of this whole stack. I'm not going to talk about this book too much because I did a whole half-hour reading vlog where I really went into it. I don't think I need to say what this book is about because I'm pretty sure everybody knows, but you're basically following a group of children as they are terrorized by a sewer clown. But you're following 2 perspectives. You're following them as children and as adults because they don't remember what they did as children to defeat him, but they have to come back and do it as adults. I really love the way that the 2 timelines tie together at the end because they're remembering at the same exact time that they're doing it in their adult lives. And then at the end of it, they forget again, and I really, really like that for the reading experience because obviously this isn't this isn't a kid's book, but this definitely could be a story that people consume when they're younger. And the idea that you can read it and then kind of forget about the story, you forget some of the details, and then you come back and reread it, and you have that same feeling that the characters have where you're experiencing and you're remembering all these things that you were introduced to as a kid, the same way that the adult characters are remembering their childhood stories. I feel like that's such a fun way to experience a story. Really love this book. I finished it at the end of October. I finished it on October 31st, but I already want to pick it up again. I really, really loved everything about this. Obviously, Stephen King's a little problematic, but the story itself was just so good. Okay, now we can get through a big chunk of this stack because series. I started reading Death Note in September. I have all 6 black editions, and I read the first 2 in September, and then the 3rd one I read in October. The last 3 I read at the start of November. I felt like the 3rd one was a little bit boring just because they're more in the business side of things, but I really like that the book is able to elaborate more on the conversations. Because if you're watching the show, you obviously don't want to listen to the characters just talk all day. You want cool dramatic things to happen, so in the book they're able to really go into the thoughts of each character. In the fourth book, some things happened where the story was able to pick back up and kind of get back to its regular pace. A lot of the deaths in the book were really abrupt. I feel like in the show there's a lot more build-up, but in these books people are just there and then they're gone, and I kind of really like that, because if you're reading this for the first time it would come as a shock pretty much every time. When you're watching the show there's kind of some build-up, there's some dramatic tension, there's all the sad scenes and all the characters are kind of sensing that something's wrong, but in these books it just kind of comes out of nowhere. For the fifth book, I don't like Nihr. If you know who that is, I don't like Nihr in the show very much. I think he's pretty annoying. He just kind of takes away the spotlight from Elle without really doing any of the work. But in the book, like I said, you're able to see more of his thought process, and I feel like he's more thought out in the books. The show doesn't really give him credit for anything that he's thinking, but in the books it kind of shows that he does put in some effort sometimes. And then in the last book, I really loved how over 150 pages were dedicated just to their final scene. It's what this whole series is building up to, and I really like that they dedicated the time to give you the full experience. And like I said, again, the deaths are really abrupt. They really just hit you and then it's over. It's not like the show. And I feel like that is such an interesting, but it's kind of an intriguing way to do things, because that's obviously how it feels to the characters. There's this death note, you're writing your name, and then people are dead. I love the show. I love the story. Again, these books hold a special place in my heart. And then on top of that, I have Death Note short stories. Same author, same illustrator. It's just some stories of maybe what happens after. So you get to see the Death Note in the hands of some other people. You get to see kind of how the world copes with what happens at the end of the series. I definitely enjoyed being able to see these characters again because, like I've said, I've seen the show so many times, and reading the book, it's all the same story, and as much as I love seeing the characters, it can obviously get a little repetitive, so to see them in a new format was kind of cool. It's full of little tiny comics that are just very silly, and it's just the characters messing around, and I really love that, because this isn't a book that you're supposed to take super seriously, it's just the characters hanging out. I really love being able to see more of them. I love them so much. The only thing that was frustrating was there's one story where they get an eraser and you can bring somebody back to life, which is obviously not something that happens in the actual story, but it's okay. It's just a what-if story. It doesn't need to be real. When I was doing my 24-hour readathon, I started reading the Chronicles of Narnia just because they are shorter books. So the fifth book that I read in November was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I have the physical copy somewhere around here. I will just read my thoughts. I said, I don't like that Santa said that girls shouldn't fight, and also, it's a little random for Santa to be here. I do like the beavers. I like that this book and this series in general is very self-aware. It will constantly reference the other books and say, hey, this happened in this book, or you might remember this from when this happened. And I wrote, this book feels like a hug because the characters are having a rough time, but at least they're having them together, and the book is so aware of how it feels to be a kid that's just doing their best. Because the kids aren't all good people, but they are kids, and they're just experiencing the world to the best of their abilities. I really love the characters. I love the environment. I know I keep saying that, but I've just been reading a lot of comfort books. Just a lot of books where friendship matters, and this is definitely one of those. I read If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. I don't have the physical copy right now because I did borrow it from my brother, but it's basically just another dark academia story. You're following a group of students who are in Shakespeare Club. They're in theater together, and they're putting on plays, and they're just, you know, it's your classic dark academia, super pretentious kids that think they're above everybody else. It is very, very similar to The Secret History with, you obviously have the relationships within the group, you also have the tension of somebody liking somebody else who's in the relationship with the main guy. You know how it is. There's like the main guy who's super cool, and then he's dating the super pretty one, and then everybody kind of likes her, and there's a whole thing. There's also a pair of, they're not siblings, they're cousins, but it's a lot of the same dynamics within the friend group. I really like the way that it's set up like a play, and if I knew anything about theater, I'm sure that would be relevant.
Well, cheese chip.
Cheese chip.
Have a bite.
Simple life and one I'm happy to live. Okay, this is just gonna be here. Very, very frequently throughout this book, they talked as if they were in a play. When this happened in The Secret History, it was okay because they were language students. Whenever they did talk in whatever language they were studying, it was fairly short sections of the book and normally something that you didn't really need for the story to move along. But in If We Were Villains, they will talk full pages of theater talk. And I've never been a theater kid. I did not understand a word of it, and that made it very hard to read, and I found myself just fully skipping those sections. I said it reminds me of the book Leo, who is a person on YouTube, saying how some people take too long to realize that you aren't supposed to want to be the characters in The Secret History. They're supposed to be bad people, but the way that these dark academia characters are presented is just so good. There was one scene where I feel like his name is James. I honestly don't remember. But it was a scene where he's really, really drunk and he's just taking lines out of his play and just throwing them out there. And the main character is like, I do not know what this man is saying. He's just spewing these lines and I am not, he did not know what was going on. And that's how I felt throughout the entire book when they started talking like that. It was also very confusing because at the same time of reading this, I was reading Loveless by Alice Oseman. And they both have a Philippa who is nicknamed Pip. Speaking of. But that is not the next book that I read. Nothing But Blackened Teeth. It's a very short book. We got it for a very, very low price at the bookstore because they're basically handing them out if you got a pastry. I have not heard good things about this book and I am not here to tell you good things about this book. I said I couldn't follow it at all and I appreciate the Asian representation, but what is happening? A lot of vocabulary in this was very large without any payoff. They didn't add anything and they really just messed up the whole flow of the story because the characters would talk very, very, very casual. But the descriptions were really, really, really pretentious. Like, didn't make any sense. Just lots of big words thrown together. Lots of descriptions that use so many unfamiliar words that they described pretty much nothing, which if that's the way that you write, then that's fine, but it has to be consistent, and in this book it really wasn't. And also, I feel like when you're reading scary books, you need to feel connected to the characters so that you feel like what's happening actually matters. And there is no point where you feel connected to these characters. You are just thrown into their story, and then it happens, and then it's over, and none of them really mattered at all. Definitely not recommend this book. I don't think I gained anything from reading it. I hate being mean to books, but also, just write a better book. I'm sorry. Anyways, then I finished Loveless by Alice Oseman. I read it mainly for the representation because same as genderqueer, it's something that's not really seen that often. It's another book that's very modern day. I've been branching out into more mature books, so this was definitely a step back and you could feel it. Not that there's anything wrong with reading that, it's just sometimes feels a little too fun for me. I really like books with higher stakes, but it was nice to get into the mindset of somebody where your biggest problem is just what people think of you. Which sounds a little silly, but sometimes I miss high school, and this book was kind of a nice way to get back into that for a little bit. Even though these characters are not in high school, they're starting college. This book does also focus on Shakespeare, which I feel like was kind of brought down by the fact that I had just finished reading If We Were Villains, so obviously I'm going to compare the two. Not that they are anything alike, but they did both mention Shakespeare, and obviously one of them is going to do it better because that was the entire focus of the book, whereas this is just kind of a side plot. There was one point where this book brought me to tears, specifically this one character. The character is Sunil, and he's the leader of the queer club, and they're sitting and talking, and he says, "I'm very tired all the time. I think sometimes I forget about looking after myself, just binging a show, or I don't know, baking a cake. I hardly ever do stuff like that. Sometimes I wish I could spend a little more time just doing something utterly pointless." Me too, man. There's another point where the main character is asking, what should I do? She's figuring out her identity and she's wondering how can she fix herself or how can she move on? And his advice is just, you're gonna be okay. There's nothing to do except be. And it's just so simple, but it's just such a comforting story. So I thought it was a little childish and silly, but also very warm and understanding, which is, I think, exactly what it was supposed to be. I read through Someone Who Will Love You in All Your Damaged Glory. This is the 9th book of November, and I definitely agree with what I believe it was Jack Edwards said about how the first story kind of is really good and then it goes downhill. Except it wasn't the first story. It was the third story, which starts on page 7, because the first story is 2 pages about being at a circus. The second story is just a list of prompts, basically. The third story is the good peak story, and then I would agree that most of them are pretty subpar. I really liked the first story because you get introduced to the characters, you get introduced to their world, and it seems fairly normal, and then the author will just throw in something that's so random, so out of nowhere, so not like our world, and you just have to take it in as part of the story. It's about a couple, and they're worrying about their wedding because they want it to be really simple, but they apparently, in their society, they have really, really big wedding ceremonies. You have to sacrifice hundreds of goats. You have to have a screaming choir. There's just a lot going on, and they don't really want to do that, but they feel like they have to sort of satiate their family. And I really like seeing that family just interact with each other and how the whole thing played out. It was very silly. But so many of these stories, I feel like what they did wrong is they're not at all... They don't make you feel for the characters. A lot of them are written in a very disconnected way. There's some that are even written in second person, which is obviously, you know, that's a harder perspective to write from. It feels like some of these stories are trying to be deep when there's not a whole lot of substance behind them. So I really like the goat story, which is the third one. And then it's immediately followed by stories where you're disconnected to the characters, which is not as fun, but I do like that it tried out different styles. I also liked the story We Men of Science, and the one about Rufus, it's narrated by a dog, and that one was pretty lighthearted, pretty silly as well. But I did start skipping pages towards the end because, like I said, they tried to be deep, but they weren't really saying much of anything. I think maybe it's a good book to just have sitting around if somebody wants to pick it up and flip through it, but in terms of actually sitting down and reading it and wanting to get something out of it, I'm not sure. The 10th book that I read was the 3rd book in the Chronicles of Narnia, The Horse and His Boy. I didn't like this as much as the other ones because there was just a lot of talking. When I look at these books, I want magic. I want talking animals, yes, but not a lot of talking from the higher-ups of the country. I don't care about their politics, and a lot of this book was based on that. I wrote that I appreciate the way that it tries to handle, like, the race and class issues, because some of these characters are poor and some of them come from like really high up in the kingdoms, and you know, I get that. I think that's cool. Throw that into a kid's story, but also I came here for magic. If it's not in Narnia, I do not care how the kingdom works. I then read, finally, it's on the ground. Oh my goodness. I should have picked that up. I fully just bent the page. That is so cool. Oh, I'm so glad I did that. It's fine. I've been reading this book since June. And I'm very upset about this because I've been trying hard to keep this copy nice, and then I just dropped it and didn't care to pick it up this whole time, but it's okay. It's split into 3 books, and I finally finished the first one. And while I was reading this, I was really reading only a little bit at a time, which is why it took me 5 months to get through. And I was very scared that if I hadn't watched the movie, because I did watch the movie before I read this, that I wouldn't know what was happening at all, and I think I spent so long thinking about that I stopped actually reading the story. I was just trying so hard to picture what was happening and how it compared to the movie. Because I watched Emmy, another booktuber, absolutely raving about this book and saying how it's just the best book that she's read in so long and how she loved how it handles humanity and all of these things. And once I heard that, I kind of came to this book with a new perspective, and I started reading it as a book instead of something to compare to the movie, and I enjoyed it so much more. And also at that point, I started annotating because I realized there are points made in this book about humanity that are just really good. I read Prince Caspian, which is the 4th book in the Chronicles of Narnia, and I love that one a lot more just because you're getting back into the characters from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I really like the 4 of them, and I loved being reintroduced to them. I'm trying to get through these fast because I didn't realize how long I've been recording. 13, I've read Miss Frisby and the Rats of Nihm. This is one that I said I wanted to read for the Bloomin' Readathon. It's just a book that I had loved forever ago, and I wanted to revisit the characters. And I didn't realize how dark of a book it is. It's a single mom who was a widow because there's just a lot. I don't want to spoil anything. But the whole backstory of the rats and the whole backstory of really everybody is really rough. And the other thing I noticed is that I've been reading a lot of books that bounce between timeline. Because this book does. The Chronicles of Narnia are kind of all over the place with timeline. The Vampire Chronicles, If We Were Villains as well. Just a lot of books where you're kind of jumping all over the place and you have to piece it together. But I really always love the story about Miss Frisby. Again, it's just another comfort read about some people who really care about each other. And then finally, I read It Starts With Us by Colleen Hoover. This is her new book. It's a sequel to It Ends With Us, which I didn't really like that one, so I had low expectations going into this one. And I gotta be honest, it was fair because my expectations somehow were still too high. I really did not enjoy this book. Ryle never had any appeal to me in the first book. I guess she thought he was attractive, but I don't know if he had any redeeming personality traits, and she acts like he does, but I never saw any. There was no point that I liked him. He was literally walking red flag. And I feel like the characters just kind of have their molds and they fit into them and they have no depth or personality outside of that. So for Atlas, you have the homeless kid who turns successful. For Ryle, he's just kind of the abusive partner that's always there. And then you have the main girl who's in this weird love triangle where she shouldn't care about one of the guys, but she still does for some reason. Which I get it. Obviously, she's in a hard cycle, and it takes a lot of work to get out of that. But did this book add anything? No. I think it could potentially be comforting to somebody who has gone through a very similar experience to see somebody talk through how to get over it so clearly, but that is exactly my problem with it. It talks through everything so clearly. There was a point, I'll put it here if I can find it, but there was a point where they're just talking and she narrates, he felt this. I know it because he reacted in this way. Like, why did you need to tell me how he's feeling? Just show me what's happening. Show me why you think he's feeling that, but don't directly say he is feeling this emotion and here's the reason. Just generally, any deep conversations that they had were just very straightforward, which is why I think it would be comforting for somebody who has gone through something similar, because you're having this sort of direct conversation and you can sort of put yourself into the character's shoes and feel like you're getting the comfort from the other character. But there was just no substance to this book. The epilogue for It Ends With Us was Lily running into Atlas and suggesting that maybe they could have something in the future. Knowing that Lily, this is a spoiler, If anybody hasn't read it, you know that Lily and Ryle are divorced, but that they have a daughter and they're sort of just gonna spend their time a little bit sharing her. And this book is basically just an extended epilogue in which nothing changes. And this is totally gonna be a spoiler for It Starts With Us, so if you haven't read this and you want to read it, then just skip over this part. But in this book, Atlas finds out he has a brother that he never knew about, and that brother is vandalizing the store because he feels like he was abandoned by his older brother. And I didn't care. I do think it was kind of cute that at the end the brother decided that their dad isn't worth the effort. But also I feel like if you want me to care about the brother, what you should have done is given hints that he was there in the first book. If Atlas already has a connection to this potential brother and then he gets kicked out of the house and he doesn't know what happens, and then in the second book when he sees somebody is vandalizing the store, he can maybe think of that as a possibility. So it adds some tension because you have one of the narrators who knows what's maybe happening but doesn't want to share it because he doesn't know for sure because he never got to meet that brother, so he doesn't know anything about him. Or even, and obviously this would take a couple things changing for it to make sense, but have Lily know that Atlas has a brother. Make it so that maybe when they're kids and Atlas leaves, Lily wants to try and find him. So she does a similar thing that Atlas does with his dad, where she finds out where the mom is living and she goes to visit there to maybe see if Atlas came back. And when she shows up there, she sees maybe Atlas's mom, maybe the dad, with a little kid. She wouldn't think to say anything because she wouldn't know if Atlas actually knows about this kid or not, but maybe she would write a journal entry about it. She would write down, hey, I saw his family with a different kid, but he's not there. I'm wondering what's going on there. Have it be a whole thing that she knows, but she kind of forgets about. It's in the back of her head, but it's in these journals. And when she gives the journals to Atlas, that's how he finds out. I think if you tied it in like that, it would have been really cool. It would have kind of added a different level of suspense, but in this book, it was all just handed to you. There was no tension. There was no point where you feel connected to what's happening because nothing was really happening. I feel like that would have at least made me care about it a little bit, but because it was just something that was thrown in, it doesn't feel like it really added anything. He's just some guy. He's just some guy and he's there now. And this is gonna sound bad, but just stay with me a minute. When you're reading It Ends With Us, there is at least a build up to a climax, and that is Ryle slowly getting more aggressive. When you're reading that book, he starts off in sort of a decent relationship and then he goes into fully just beating her up. And that was sort of the big deal of the story, and then she gets away and whatever happens. And that was all at least a little bit interesting because there was a build up to some big moment. But when you're reading this book, there's nothing that changes from the start to the end. There's no reason why I care more about these characters now. And I guess it could be cool if you like Atlas and you want to hear more about his backstory, because Atlas as a person sounds really cool, but as a character in this book, he doesn't add anything. As always, this whole video is completely just my opinion, so I hope nobody is offended, because if you understand or you enjoy these books, then that is so good for you, but they're just not for me. And then right now, I'm reading the second book in the Vampire Chronicles, and I'm reading the 5th book in the Chronicles of Narnia, which maybe I'll finish by the end of the month, maybe not. This video is getting way too long, so I'm gonna go. You know the drill. If you like this video, you can subscribe to this channel. You can also subscribe to my main channel, Riverbxnd, which thank you so much for 900 subscribers on there. That is pretty cool. You can also follow my Instagram, TikTok, Spotify. It's all the same name and in the description of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys in my next video. Very excited. Festive times are upon us.